How I made my family confess to destroying my life. I came home to find an eviction notice on the door of the house I'd inherited from my grandmother. The tenants destroying it from the inside weren't strangers. They were my own family. When Grandma died, she left me her brownstone in Brooklyn, worth $2 million, paid off mine. But she'd also left me her guilt. Take care of them, she'd whispered in hospice. They're family. They need you. So I let my cousin Derek move into the basement. Then my Aunt Deborah claimed the second floor temporarily. My Uncle Rory took the guest room. My younger cousins Sienna and Kyle got the attic. My mother's brother Dennis and his wife filled the last bedroom. 7 family members. My grandmother's dying wish. My financial ruin. None of them paid rent. Not once in 18 months. They said family doesn't charge family. They said Grandma would be ashamed. They said I owed them because Grandma had always favored me. The eviction notice wasn't a surprise. I'd been covering the property taxes alone, watching my savings drain to nothing. But seeing it in writing made something snap. I walked into the living room where all 6 of them were watching TV on the couch I'd bought, eating food from the refrigerator I'd stocked, complaining about the heating bill I'd paid. I unplugged the television. Here's the deal. You're all living here rent-free, illegally. If we get evicted, I lose the house, but you all get records for illegal tenancy. I could also report the cash businesses some of you have been running. Everyone went pale. Confess everything you've been doing behind my back in 5 minutes, or I start making calls. I set the timer on my phone. Derek cracked first at 4 minutes 32 seconds. I've been renting out the basement on Airbnb, he blurted. $300 a night. I've made $20,000 since I moved in. Aunt Deborah's face went purple. You've been what? I've been telling my church group this is a family-only residence. Your church group? Derek laughed. You've been hosting unlicensed daycare in the backyard. 8 kids a day. That's why the neighbors keep complaining. At least I'm not selling from the house like Kyle. Kyle shot up. You promised you wouldn't tell. Tell what? I said quietly. Sienna rolled her eyes. He's been dealing from the attic. Why do you think so many friends come by at night? Oh, like you're innocent? Kyle spat. She's been stealing from you for months. Jewelry, electronics, selling them online. Sienna's face crumbled. I needed money. None of us have jobs because Deborah keeps saying family takes care of family while she charges her daycare parents under the table. Uncle Rory stood up slowly. He was the quiet one. The one I'd trusted most. Since we're confessing, he said, I remortgaged the house 6 months ago. The room went silent. You what? I couldn't breathe. I forged your signature. Took out $400,000. Dennis and I split it. We were going to pay it back before you noticed. I turned to Dennis. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The bank statements, I whispered. The ones that stopped coming. I redirected them to my PO box, Dennis admitted. Rory's idea. The timer showed 2 minutes left when my mother walked in. She'd been staying in the master bedroom, my grandmother's room. She'd claimed it for sentimental reasons. What's all the yelling? Everyone looked at her, then at me. Tell her, Aunt Deborah said coldly. Tell her what you did. My mother's face tightened. I don't know what you're... Mom. What did you do? Silence. Then Deborah. She changed the will. The original left everything split 7 ways. Your mother altered it before Grandma died. Made herself executor. Made you sole inheritor. Because she knew you'd let us all live here for free while she controlled everything. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. You told me Grandma wanted me to have the house. She did. She wanted it split. You changed it. I was protecting you. They would have sold it immediately. At least this way. At least this way you got to play martyr while everyone else destroyed my credit and my inheritance and my life? The timer went off. Nobody moved. I looked around at my family. The cousin running an illegal hotel. The aunt running an illegal daycare. The cousin dealing drugs. The other cousin stealing my belongings. The uncles who'd committed mortgage fraud. The mother who'd forged a dying woman's will. I'm calling the police, I said. You can't, my mother said quietly. You'd lose everything. The house, the money, years in court fighting the mortgage fraud. They'll say you were complicit. She was right. They'd set it up perfectly. We were all drowning together. That was your plan all along, I realized. Make me dependent on keeping family secrets. My mother finally met my eyes. That's what family does, sweetheart. We protect each other. I looked at the eviction notice still in my hand, at the family that had consumed everything my grandmother built, at the trap I'd never escape. I stood there with the eviction notice crumpling in my fist, while 7 pairs of eyes stared back at me. The silence pressed against my ears like water. My mother's words hung in the air between us. "That's what family does, sweetheart. We protect each other." The room tilted slightly and I grabbed the back of the couch to steady myself. She'd planned this from the beginning. Changed the will so I'd inherit everything alone, knowing I'd let them all move in, knowing they'd create this web of crimes that would trap me with them. If I called the police, the mortgage fraud would destroy my credit for years. The investigation would show I owned the house where drugs were being sold. I'd lose everything fighting to prove I didn't know. She'd made sure of that. Derek wouldn't meet my eyes. Deborah sat rigid on the couch, her hands folded like she was praying. Rory stared at the floor. Dennis had his arms crossed, defensive. Kyle looked ready to bolt. Sienna was crying quietly. My mother just watched me with that calm expression she wore when she knew she'd won. I turned and walked out. Nobody tried to stop me. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice before I got the car door open. The engine started and I pulled away from the curb without looking back at the brownstone. 3 blocks. I just needed to get 3 blocks away before I fell apart completely. The diner on the corner had its lights on, the kind of place that stayed open all night for insomniacs and third-shift workers. I parked crooked across 2 spaces and stumbled inside. The waitress looked up from wiping down the counter but didn't say anything when I slid into the corner booth farthest from the door. She brought coffee without asking. I wrapped both hands around the mug even though the ceramic burned my palms. My phone sat on the table in front of me. The screen showed 11:47 p.m. I opened the browser and typed real estate attorney Brooklyn, then mortgage fraud lawyer, then property fraud victim. The search results blurred together. I clicked on links and read words that didn't stick in my brain. Legal aid, free consultation, sliding scale fees. My coffee went cold. The waitress refilled it twice without speaking. Other customers came and went. A man in a security uniform, 2 women in scrubs, a teenager with headphones, normal people living normal lives where their families didn't forge documents and trap them in shared guilt. At 2:30 a.m., I found a legal aid office that opened at 9. I screenshotted the address. At 3:15 a.m., I had a list of 5 real estate attorneys and 3 criminal defense lawyers. My phone battery showed 15%. I finally drank some of the coffee. It tasted like burnt dirt, but the caffeine hit my empty stomach and made my hands shake worse. The sun came up gray and cold. I'd been sitting in the same booth for 6 hours. The morning shift waitress gave me a concerned look when she arrived, but brought more coffee anyway. At 8:45 a.m., I drove to the legal aid office and parked across the street. The building was old brick with a blue door. A sign in the window said Brooklyn Legal Services. I sat in my car watching people walk past on the sidewalk. Dog walkers, parents with strollers, everyone going about their normal Friday morning. At 9:03, a woman in a green coat walked up to the blue door and unlocked it. I got out of my car before I could talk myself out of it. The woman looked up when I pushed through the door. She had gray hair pulled back in a clip and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her desk nameplate said, Maya Lambert, Legal Advocate. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. She smiled gently and gestured to the chair across from her desk. I sat down and the whole story came pouring out. The inheritance, the family moving in, 18 months of no rent, the eviction notice, the confessions, Derek's Airbnb, Deborah's daycare, Kyle dealing drugs, Sienna stealing my things, the mortgage fraud, $400,000, forged signature, my mother changing the will, the trap she'd built so carefully. Maya took notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving steadily across the paper. She asked questions. When did your grandmother die? When did the family members move in? When did you first learn about the mortgage? Do you have any documentation? I answered everything I could remember. My voice sounded hollow and far away. When I finished, Maya set down her pen and looked at me directly. She explained that mortgage fraud made me a victim, not a criminal. The forged signature meant I never agreed to that loan. But proving I didn't know about it would require evidence. Bank statements showing the money never went into my accounts. Proof I was somewhere else when the documents were supposedly signed. Witnesses who could verify I had no knowledge of the fraud. The process would take months. I'd need a real estate attorney who specialized in property fraud, someone with experience fighting banks and dealing with complex family situations. Maya pulled out a business card from her desk drawer and wrote a number on the back. Sloan Whitley, real estate law. She works on sliding scale fees based on income. Tell her I sent you. I took the card with numb fingers. Maya said she'd make a call to let Sloan know I'd be reaching out. She also said I should document everything happening at the house. Take photos, save text messages, record dates and times of illegal activities if possible. Evidence would be crucial for any legal action. I thanked her and stood up to leave. She touched my arm gently before I reached the door. You didn't do anything wrong. Your family put you in an impossible situation. Don't let them make you believe otherwise. I called Sloane Whitley from my car. She answered on the third ring with a brisk professional voice. I explained that Maya Lambert had referred me and asked if she had time to meet. She had a cancellation that afternoon at 2. Could I make it to her office in downtown Brooklyn? I said yes before my brain could process that I'd been awake for over 30 hours. Her office was in a converted warehouse building with exposed brick and industrial windows. The elevator was old and slow. Sloane's office was on the 4th floor, a small space with a desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets covering one entire wall. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair in a ponytail and sharp eyes that assessed me the moment I walked in. I sat down and went through the whole story again. This time I had my phone out, showing her screenshots of text messages from family members, photos of the eviction notice, the address of the brownstone. Sloane listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from sympathetic to calculating. When I got to the part about my mother changing the will, she leaned forward. That's actually important. It establishes a pattern of manipulation and fraud. If your mother altered legal documents before your grandmother's death, it supports your claim that you're a victim of ongoing deception, not a willing participant in mortgage fraud. Sloane explained that we needed to find the original will, the one my grandmother actually signed before my mother changed it. If there were witnesses to the original will signing, their testimony would be valuable. We also needed to prove the timeline of when my mother altered the documents. She asked if I knew who handled my grandmother's estate planning originally. I didn't know. She asked if any of my grandmother's friends or neighbors might have information. I sat there trying to think through the fog of exhaustion. Then I remembered Shelby McGowan, my grandmother's next-door neighbor for 30 years. She'd visited constantly during those final months. She'd been at the funeral. She'd hugged me and said how much my grandmother loved me. If anyone knew about my grandmother's actual wishes, it would be Shelby. I told Sloane about her. She made a note on her legal pad. Talk to Shelby as soon as possible. Find out what she knows about the original will. Get names of any lawyers your grandmother worked with. We need to build a timeline of events that shows your mother's manipulation. I agreed to go see Shelby that evening. Sloane said she'd start pulling property records and mortgage documents in the meantime. She also said her fee would be $200 an hour, but she'd work with me on a payment plan. The retainer would be $2,000. I felt my stomach drop but nodded. I'd put it on a credit card. I didn't have any other choice. I drove to Shelby's house as the sun started setting. She lived 3 doors down from the brownstone in a narrow house with flower boxes in the windows. I rang the bell and heard footsteps inside. Shelby opened the door with a smile that faded when she saw my face. Sweetheart, what's wrong? She pulled me inside before I could answer. Her living room smelled like vanilla and old books. She made me sit on her couch and brought tea I didn't drink. I explained what had been happening. The family living rent-free, the illegal activities, the mortgage fraud, my mother changing the will. Shelby's face went pale. She set down her teacup with shaking hands. Your grandmother never wanted that. She talked about it constantly those last few months, how she wanted to split everything equally. 7 ways. She said it over and over because she was worried about causing fights after she was gone. Shelby stood up and went to a bookshelf in the corner. She pulled out an old address book with a worn leather cover. Your grandmother had me come with her to the lawyer's office 2 years before she died. She wanted a witness when she signed her will. She was very clear about her wishes. Equal shares for everyone. The lawyer's name was William Park. I still have his card. Shelby flipped through the address book until she found a business card tucked between the pages. Chen and Associates, Estate Planning. The card had a phone number and an address in the Park Slope. Shelby pulled out her cell phone right there and dialed. She left a message explaining that she'd been a witness to Eleanor's will signing 2 years ago and needed to speak with him urgently about a legal matter involving the estate. She left her number and mine. When she hung up, she looked at me with fierce determination. Your grandmother was a good woman. She would be horrified by what's happening. I'm going to help you fix this. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I blinked them back. I thanked Shelby and promised to keep her updated. She walked me to the door and hugged me tight. You're stronger than you think. Your grandmother knew that. That's why she loved you so much. I drove back to my hotel room and collapsed on the bed. My phone showed 15 missed calls from my mother. I deleted them without listening to the voicemails. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:30 a.m. an unknown number. I answered it anyway. A man's voice asked for me by name and then introduced himself as William Park, estate planning attorney. Shelby McGowan had left him a message about Eleanor's will. He sounded concerned. I explained the situation as clearly as I could. He went quiet for a long moment. Then he said he'd drafted a will for Eleanor 2 years before her death that split all assets equally among 7 family members. He'd filed it with the probate court. He was shocked to learn a different version had been submitted after her death. He asked if I had legal representation. I gave him Sloane Whitley's contact information. He said he'd reach out to her directly and provide copies of all the original documents. He'd also be willing to testify about Eleanor's clearly stated intentions. This was serious. Will forgery was a crime. I thanked him and hung up. Then I called Sloane and told her. She sounded energized. This is exactly what we need. With the original attorney's testimony and documents, we can prove your mother committed fraud. This establishes the pattern of manipulation. I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe I wasn't trapped after all. Maybe there was a way out of this that didn't destroy me along with them. I needed clothes and my laptop. I drove back to the brownstone in the middle of the afternoon when most of the family would be out. Derek worked construction jobs sometimes. Deborah would be at the grocery store. Kyle never got up before 3. I used my key and pushed open the front door quietly. The house smelled stale. Dishes piled in the sink. Mail scattered across the hall table. I headed upstairs to my old bedroom. The door was closed. I opened it and froze. My mother sat on my bed waiting for me. She'd known I'd come back. Of course she had. She always knew. She looked tired, older than I'd ever seen her. She patted the space next to her on the bed. We need to talk about this rationally. I stayed in the doorway with my hand on the knob. She started explaining in that reasonable voice she used when she wanted to sound like the adult in the room. She'd changed the will to protect me. The rest of the family would have sold the brownstone immediately and split the money. It would have been gone in months. At least this way I had a valuable asset. She'd made me the sole inheritor so I'd have security. She'd let everyone move in because she knew I'd feel obligated to help family. It was her way of keeping everyone together, making sure no one was homeless or struggling. She'd been trying to take care of everyone. Yes, things had gotten messy. Yes, Rory and Dennis had made a terrible mistake with the mortgage. But that wasn't her fault. She couldn't have predicted that. We were still family. We could work this out together if I'd just stopped being so dramatic. I told her protection doesn't involve forgery. It doesn't involve fraud. It doesn't involve trapping someone in shared criminal responsibility so they can't escape. Her wounded expression shifted. The warmth drained out of her eyes and left something cold behind. She stood up and walked toward me. I stepped back into the hallway. She said I was being dramatic and ungrateful. She'd raised me. She'd sacrificed everything for me. And this was how I repaid her? By threatening to destroy the family? By working with lawyers to tear everyone apart? Family protects family even when it's messy. Even when it's hard. Even when it requires difficult choices. I needed to remember who had been there for me my entire life before I made my next decision. Because if I went through with this legal action, if I testified against my own family, there would be no coming back from that. I'd be alone. No mother, no cousins, no aunts or uncles. Just me and my self-righteousness and my precious property. Was that really what I wanted? I looked at my mother standing in the hallway of the house her mother had built. The house she'd manipulated and schemed to control. The house she'd used to trap me in her web of lies. I told her I'd rather be alone than be her accomplice. Then I walked past her into my room, grabbed my laptop and a bag of clothes, and left while she stood there watching me go. I stayed at the hotel that night and barely slept. My phone kept buzzing with texts from different family members, but I didn't read any of them. Around 11 p.m., Derek's name showed up on my screen and I almost ignored it. But something made me answer. He asked if we could meet alone somewhere away from the house. His voice sounded different from usual. Tired, maybe. Or scared. I told him there was a coffee shop near Prospect Park that stayed open late, and he said he'd be there in 20 minutes. I got dressed and drove over, parking under a streetlight because I wasn't taking chances with any of them anymore. Derek was already inside when I walked in, sitting at a corner table with his hands wrapped around a cup he hadn't touched. He looked terrible. His eyes were red and his usual cocky expression was completely gone. He stood up when he saw me, but didn't try to hug me or do any of that fake family warmth thing. We just sat down across from each other and stared at our drinks for a minute. Then he started talking. He said he wanted out of this whole situation. He never thought things would get this bad. When he started the Airbnb thing, it was just supposed to be temporary money until he got back on his feet. He didn't know about the mortgage fraud, or my mother changing the will, or any of the really bad stuff, until everything came out during my timer confession game. Now he was terrified because he knew what he'd done was illegal, and he didn't want to go down with Rory and Dennis for crimes he didn't even know about. I asked him what he expected me to do about that. He leaned forward and said he'd testify. About everything. All the family's illegal activities. Whatever I needed. He said he kept detailed records of his Airbnb income because he was planning to report it on his taxes eventually. He had spreadsheets with dates and amounts and guest names. He didn't realize it at the time, but those records accidentally documented the whole timeline of who was in the house when and what was happening. He pulled out his phone and showed me. Months of data. Proof of everything. His hands shook while he scrolled through the files. He said he was terrified of criminal charges, and he wanted to cooperate before everyone turned on each other even worse than they already had. He knew how these things worked. Someone was going to flip eventually, and he wanted it to be him. He wanted immunity or reduced charges or whatever deal he could get. I sat there looking at this cousin who'd stolen from me for 18 months and now wanted me to save him. Part of me wanted to tell him to go to hell. But another part knew he was offering me exactly what I needed. Proof. Documentation. A witness who could testify about the family dynamics and illegal operations. I told him I'd talk to my lawyer. The next morning I called Sloan and explained about Derek. She said to bring him to her office that afternoon. Derek showed up early looking even more nervous than he had at the coffee shop. He brought a laptop and a folder full of printed documents. Sloan spent an hour going through everything with him, while I sat there watching my cousin potentially save himself by destroying the rest of the family. When she finished reviewing his records, she made a phone call to someone at the district attorney's office. She explained she had a potential cooperating witness in a mortgage fraud case. The person on the other end must have been interested because Sloan's expression shifted from cautious to satisfied. She covered the phone and asked Derek if he was willing to provide sworn testimony. He nodded so fast I thought his head might fall off. Sloan went back to the call and arranged a meeting for later that week. The ADA wanted to see Derek's documentation first and interview him to determine if his cooperation was worth an immunity deal. After Sloan hung up, she looked at Derek and told him this was his one chance. If he lied or held anything back, the deal was off and he'd face charges like everyone else. Derek swore he'd tell them everything. He just wanted this nightmare to end. Sloan said she'd need to refer him to his own attorney because she represented me, and there was a conflict of interest in representing both of us. She gave him 3 names of criminal defense lawyers who worked well with prosecutors on cooperation agreements. Derek left looking slightly less terrified than when he arrived. 2 days later, Sloan called and said she had someone she wanted me to meet. Cade Vaughn. A forensic accountant she worked with regularly on fraud cases. He could analyze the mortgage documents and financial records to find proof of forgery. I met Cade at Sloan's office the next morning. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with glasses and the kind of calm confidence that made you think he knew exactly what he was doing. I gave him everything I'd managed to collect. Copies of the mortgage documents, bank statements I'd found before Dennis redirected them, property tax records, my own financial records showing my income and signature patterns. Cade spread it all out on Sloan's conference table and started taking notes. He said signature forgery cases usually came down to forensic analysis of the actual signatures, plus circumstantial evidence like opportunity and motive. He'd start with the signatures and work backward from there. It would take him about a week to do a thorough analysis. I left him there with my entire financial life spread across the table, and tried not to think about how much I was trusting strangers to fix what my family had destroyed. Cade called me 6 days later and asked me to come back to Sloan's office. When I got there, he had a whole presentation set up on a laptop. He walked me through it step by step. The signature on the mortgage documents didn't match my actual signature in 12 different measurable ways. The pressure patterns were wrong. The letter formations were inconsistent with my usual handwriting. The speed of the signing was different from my normal pace. He'd compared it to signatures on my tax returns and bank documents and employment contracts, and the differences were obvious once you knew what to look for. He said any handwriting expert would testify this was a forgery. Then he showed me where the money went. $400,000 split between accounts controlled by Rory and Dennis. Rory got $250,000. Dennis got $150,000. They'd tried to hide it by moving the money through several accounts, but Cade traced every transfer. He had documentation showing the exact path of every dollar. Sloan looked at me and said this was enough. Enough to prove fraud. Enough to potentially void the mortgage. Enough to build a criminal case. I sat there staring at the evidence that my uncles had forged my signature and stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I felt nothing. Just empty and tired and done with all of it. The next day, a woman named Sapphira Kumar called my cell phone. She introduced herself as a fraud investigator with the bank that issued the mortgage. She said their internal audit had flagged the mortgage as suspicious, and they were conducting their own investigation separate from any criminal case. She asked if I was willing to cooperate. I said yes immediately. She asked if we could meet that afternoon at a coffee shop near the bank's main office. I showed up with copies of everything Cade had found. Sapphira was in her 40s with short dark hair and an expression that said she'd seen every kind of fraud there was. She looked through my documents carefully and asked detailed questions about the timeline. When did I first learn about the mortgage? When was I supposedly at the signing? Did I have any proof of where I actually was that day? I pulled out my phone and showed her my calendar from 6 months ago. The day listed on the mortgage documents, I was in Chicago at a work conference. I had hotel receipts, flight confirmations, photos I'd posted on social media from the conference. There was no possible way I could have signed those documents in New York. Sapphira took pictures of everything with her phone. She said banks took signature forgery extremely seriously because it exposed them to massive liability. She explained that her investigation ran parallel to any criminal case but had different goals. The bank wanted to prove fraud so they could void the mortgage and pursue Rory and Dennis for the money. That actually helped me because it meant the debt would disappear. She said the evidence I'd provided plus Cade's forensic analysis should be sufficient to prove fraud. She'd file her report within 2 weeks. I was back at my hotel room that evening when someone knocked on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw Deborah standing in the hallway. My mother must have told her where I was staying. I thought about not opening it, but I knew she'd just keep coming back. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. She pushed past me anyway and stood in the middle of my room looking around like she was inspecting it. She started talking before I could tell her to leave. She said I was tearing the family apart over money and property. That grandmother would be ashamed of me for abandoning family in their time of need. That I was being selfish and cruel and throwing away decades of family bonds over temporary problems that could be worked out if I'd just stopped being so stubborn. She said family forgives family. Family helps family. Family doesn't call lawyers and investigators and destroy each other's lives over mistakes. Her voice got louder as she went on, and I realized she actually believed what she was saying. She'd convinced herself that running an illegal daycare and enabling fraud and living rent-free for 18 months while I went broke was somehow justified by the word family. I waited until she finished, and then I told her grandmother would be ashamed of family members running illegal businesses from her house and forging documents in my name. That family doesn't mean letting people destroy your life while hiding behind guilt and obligation. That I didn't tear this family apart. They did. By lying and stealing and manipulating and expecting me to protect them from the consequences. Deborah's righteous expression cracked just slightly. Her mouth tightened and her eyes went cold. She said I'd always thought I was better than everyone else. That grandmother had spoiled me and made me think I was special. That I'd regret this when I was alone with nobody left who cared about me. Then she walked out and slammed the door hard enough that the pictures on the wall rattled. I sat down on the bed and realized I didn't feel guilty anymore. Just tired. The next morning, Sloan filed a motion to halt the eviction proceedings. She attached all of Cade's forensic evidence and Sapphira's preliminary report and my own documentation proving I was out of state when the mortgage was supposedly signed. The motion argued that I was a victim of identity theft and forgery and shouldn't lose my property because of crimes committed against me. She requested a temporary stay while the fraud investigation proceeded. The judge reviewed everything and granted the stay within 48 hours. Sloan called me with the news and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. She said this gave us breathing room to build the rest of the case without the immediate threat of losing the house. I thanked her and hung up and sat there feeling like I could breathe properly for the first time in weeks. That night I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Kyle's voice came through sounding paranoid and angry. He demanded to know if I was really going to send family members to jail over minor stuff. I asked him since when was $400,000 in mortgage fraud minor. He said I knew what he meant. The other stuff. The small things people did to get by. I told him dealing drugs from my property wasn't small. It put me at legal risk I never agreed to. It could have gotten the house seized by police. His activities endangered everything grandmother left me. Kyle said I was being dramatic and everyone sold a little weed sometimes. I said that wasn't the point. The point was, he did it in my house without my knowledge or permission, and expected me to protect him when it all came out. He got quiet for a minute and then said I'd regret this. That family didn't forget. I told him I'd already lost my family the day they decided stealing from me was acceptable, and hung up before he could respond. I blocked Kyle's number after that call and spent the next morning researching private investigators in Brooklyn. Sloan had mentioned that documenting the ongoing illegal activities would help our case, and I wanted everything on record before anyone had time to cover their tracks. I found Houston Vaughn through Sloan's recommendation. He was Cade's brother and specialized in surveillance work for legal cases. His office was in a converted warehouse near the waterfront, and when I walked in, he was reviewing footage on 3 different computer screens. He looked up and gestured to a chair across from his desk. I explained the situation while he took notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression getting more focused as I listed each illegal activity happening at the brownstone. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, this was exactly the kind of case where professional documentation made the difference between speculation and proof. He could conduct surveillance over several days and create a detailed report with timestamps and photographs that would be admissible in court. The cost would be $1,500, which made my stomach drop. But he said Sloan had already worked out a payment plan where I could pay half now and half after the case resolved. I agreed and signed his contract, feeling like I was finally taking real action instead of just reacting to everyone else's moves. Houston started surveillance 2 days later. He parked in different spots around the block and used cameras with zoom lenses to document everything happening at the brownstone. On the first day, he captured Derek greeting an Airbnb guest at the basement entrance and exchanging keys for cash. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. On the second day, he photographed Deborah's daycare operation in the backyard, counting 8 children between ages 2 and 5 playing on equipment that looked rusty and dangerous. He got shots of parents dropping off kids and handing Deborah envelopes, all transactions happening outside where neighbors could see, but apparently nobody had reported yet. The third day was when he documented the visitors to the attic. Between 9 p.m. and midnight, 5 different people arrived at the side door, stayed for less than 10 minutes each, and left carrying small packages. Houston's report noted the pattern matched typical street-level drug distribution, and the photographs showed Kyle greeting each visitor personally. When Houston delivered his final report to Sloan's office, I sat there reading through 20 pages of detailed observations with attached photographic evidence. The scope of illegal activity was worse than I'd realized. Derek had hosted guests at least twice a week for the past month alone. Deborah's daycare ran 5 days a week without any visible safety measures or proper licensing. Kyle's operation showed a level of organization that made it clear this wasn't casual dealing among friends. Sloan reviewed everything and said this documentation would be crucial for multiple aspects of our case. It proved the family members were generating income from my property, without my knowledge or consent. It demonstrated ongoing criminal activity that put the property at legal risk. It showed a pattern of exploitation that supported my claim of being victimized rather than complicit. She made copies for the police, for the bank fraud investigator, and for our own files. The police detective called me 3 days after Houston submitted his report to the precinct. His name was Detective Brooks, and his voice sounded tired when he asked if I could come in for a formal interview about the mortgage fraud case. I arrived at the precinct at 10 a.m. on a Thursday and spent the next 4 hours in a small interview room going through everything. Brooks recorded the whole conversation and took detailed notes while I explained the timeline of discovering the fraud, finding out about the forged signature, learning about the redirected bank statements. He asked specific questions about my relationship with Rory and Dennis, whether I'd ever given them permission to access my financial information, whether I'd signed any documents I didn't fully read. I answered everything honestly, and provided copies of my work travel records, proving I was in Chicago for a conference on the date the mortgage documents were supposedly signed in Brooklyn. Brooks reviewed the forensic analysis from Cade, showing the signature irregularities and the timeline of money transfers to accounts controlled by Rory and Dennis. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair and said Rory and Dennis would likely face felony charges for forgery, fraud, and identity theft. The evidence was strong enough that the district attorney would probably pursue prosecution even if it went to trial. He said I should prepare for this to take months, possibly over a year, to fully resolve through the criminal justice system. I thanked him and left feeling both relieved that the investigation was moving forward and exhausted by how long this process would take. My phone buzzed with an Instagram message that evening while I was eating takeout in my hotel room. The message was from Sienna asking if we could meet up because she had something important to tell me. I stared at the message for several minutes, suspicious of what she might want. She'd been part of the group that destroyed my belongings and sold them online. She'd sat there during the confrontation and admitted to stealing from me without showing much remorse. But something about the message felt different, more vulnerable than defensive. I replied asking what this was about, and she said she couldn't explain over text but needed to talk to me alone. I agreed to meet at a coffee shop in the Park Slope the next afternoon, choosing a public place where I'd feel safe. When I arrived, Sienna was already sitting at a corner table looking smaller and younger than I remembered. She was 17 but seemed like a scared kid rather than the defiant teenager from that night in the living room. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, and she twisted a napkin between her hands while I sat down across from her. She started talking before I could say anything, the words rushing out like she'd been holding them in too long. She said she needed to tell me the truth about why she stole my things and sold them online. Sienna explained that Kyle had pressured her into helping him for months. He'd discovered she had a girlfriend and threatened to tell the whole family if she didn't cooperate with his plans to make money. She was terrified of being outed to Deborah and the others who she knew would react badly. Kyle told her it was just borrowing things temporarily, that he'd pay me back eventually, that family helped family. But then he kept demanding more, taking bigger risks, and she couldn't figure out how to stop without exposing herself. She'd made about $3,000 total from selling my belongings online, and she still had most of it because she was too scared to spend it. She wanted to return what money she had left and testify about Kyle's manipulation and drug dealing. She said she was done protecting him and done being scared of what the family would think. Her voice shook when she said she knew I probably hated her and had every right to, but she needed me to know she wasn't a bad person, even though she'd done bad things. I sat there watching her cry into her shredded napkin and realized she was another victim of the family's twisted dynamics, just younger and more trapped than I'd been. I asked her if she was safe where she was living, and she said she'd moved in with her girlfriend's family after everything exploded. They knew about the situation and were helping her figure out what to do next. I told her I didn't hate her, but I needed to think about what happened next and talk to my lawyer about how to handle this. She nodded and pushed an envelope across the table containing $2,800 in cash. I took it and said I'd be in touch soon. I brought Sienna to meet with Sloan 2 days later. Sloan's office felt less intimidating this time, maybe because I was there to help someone instead of just trying to save myself. Sienna sat between us on the couch and repeated everything she'd told me about Kyle's manipulation and threats. Sloan listened carefully and asked questions about the timeline, about what evidence Sienna might have of Kyle's drug dealing, about whether Sienna had been coerced or participated willingly. When Sienna explained she was a minor who'd been threatened by an adult family member, Sloan's expression shifted to something more protective. She said we needed to handle this carefully to protect Sienna from criminal charges, while still using her testimony against Kyle. Sloan made some calls while we waited, and within an hour she'd connected with a family law specialist named Jennifer Torres, who agreed to represent Sienna separately. Jennifer arrived at the office and spent an hour talking with Sienna privately, while Sloan and I waited in the conference room. When they came back, Jennifer explained that Sienna qualified for protection as a minor who was coerced and manipulated by an adult. If Sienna cooperated fully with the investigation and testified about Kyle's activities, Jennifer could negotiate immunity from charges related to the theft. The key was establishing that Sienna had been threatened and pressured, which her age and the circumstances supported. Sienna agreed to everything and signed paperwork authorizing Jennifer to represent her. When we left Sloan's office, Sienna hugged me quickly and whispered thank you before getting in her girlfriend's car. I stood on the sidewalk watching them drive away and felt something shift inside me. Maybe not everyone in this family was beyond saving. My mother started calling me constantly over the next week. The first messages were her usual guilt-tripping routine about how I was tearing the family apart and breaking her heart. Then the tone shifted to anger, her voice getting sharp as she said I was being vindictive and cruel. By the 4th day, she'd moved into bargaining mode, leaving long voicemails about how she could fix everything if I just dropped the legal cases. She claimed she could make Rory and Dennis pay back the mortgage money. She said she'd get everyone to move out of the house voluntarily. She promised things would be different if I gave her one more chance to make it right. I didn't return any of the calls. I saved all the voicemails as evidence and forwarded them to Sloan, who said they demonstrated my mother's awareness of the crimes and her attempts to obstruct justice. Each message made it clear that my mother understood exactly what had happened and was trying to manipulate me into protecting everyone from consequences. On the 7th day, she sent a text saying we needed to meet face-to-face to discuss this like adults. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I showed the text to Sloan, who said if I was going to meet with my mother, it should happen at a neutral location with Sloan present as a witness. I agreed and replied to my mother suggesting we meet at a diner near the courthouse. She responded immediately saying she'd be there. I arrived at the diner 15 minutes early with Sloan. We took a booth near the back where we could see the entrance, and I ordered coffee I didn't drink while we waited. My mother walked in exactly on time wearing the outfit she always chose when she wanted to look respectable and reasonable. She saw Sloan sitting next to me and her expression tightened, but she slid into the opposite side of the booth without commenting. She started talking immediately about how we could resolve everything without more legal action. She said Rory and Dennis were willing to pay back the $400,000 in installments if I dropped the criminal charges. She claimed Deborah would shut down the daycare and Derek would stop the Airbnb operation. She promised Kyle would move out and get help for his problems. She made it sound like she had authority to negotiate all of this, like she could orchestrate solutions the way she'd orchestrated the original trap. Sloan let her talk for about 5 minutes before interrupting. Sloan pointed out that my mother had no legal standing to negotiate anything since she'd orchestrated the will fraud that started this entire situation. The criminal charges against Rory and Dennis were being pursued by the state, not by me personally, so I couldn't drop them even if I wanted to. The illegal activities at the Brownstone were separate criminal matters that didn't require my participation to prosecute. My mother's promises were meaningless because she'd already proven she couldn't be trusted and had no actual control over anyone's behavior. My mother's face went red while Sloan spoke, and I could see her struggling to maintain her reasonable expression. My mother's mask dropped completely when Sloan finished. She turned to me and said I was destroying the family over pride and money, that I was choosing property over people who loved me. She said grandmother would be ashamed of what I was doing, that I was spitting on her memory by refusing to protect family. Her voice got louder and other people in the diner started looking over at our booth. I waited until she ran out of words and then said she chose manipulation over honesty and created this situation. I told her she forged grandmother's will and trapped me in shared guilt and expected me to protect everyone from consequences of crimes I didn't commit. I said I wasn't destroying the family. I was refusing to be her accomplice anymore. She stared at me for a long moment and then stood up and walked out without another word. Sloan reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly before letting go. We sat there in silence for a few minutes before paying the check and leaving. I felt empty rather than relieved, like something that had been weighing me down was gone but left a hollow space behind. The probate attorney called Sloan a week later with news that changed everything again. He'd filed a formal challenge to the will that had been submitted to the court, providing his original documents and testimony about grandmother's actual intentions. The challenge argued that the will on file had been altered without proper legal authority and didn't reflect grandmother's true wishes. This opened up the possibility of invalidating my sole inheritance and returning to the original 7-way split grandmother had intended. Sloan explained this to me carefully, watching my face for reaction. I asked what it meant for the house and the legal cases, and she said it complicated everything, but might actually help in the long run. It proved my mother's pattern of manipulation and showed I was willing to accept the legitimate outcome, even if it meant getting less money. If the probate court ruled in favor of the original will, the property would be split 7 ways as grandmother actually wanted. Each family member would own 1/7 of the brownstone, which meant we'd probably have to sell it since nobody could agree on anything anymore. My share would be roughly $285,000 instead of $2 million, assuming the house sold for close to its appraised value. I sat there processing this information and realized I felt okay about it. I'd rather have the truth and a smaller inheritance than keep living in the trap my mother had built. Sloan said this decision showed real growth and integrity, that most people in my position would fight to keep the full inheritance regardless of how they got it. I told her I just wanted to be done with all the lies and manipulation, even if it cost me money. She smiled and said that attitude would serve me well as we moved forward with everything else. The probate challenge felt like it should have broken me, but sitting across from Sloan in her office 2 days later, I felt something unexpected. She spread the documents across her desk and explained that the challenge actually helped my case. It proved my mother had been manipulating legal documents from the start, showed a pattern of fraud that went beyond just one altered will. The court would see I was willing to accept whatever grandmother actually wanted, even if it meant losing most of the inheritance. That kind of honesty mattered to judges. If the property got split 7 ways like grandmother originally intended, at least everything would be based on truth instead of my mother's lies. I'd rather have $285,000 that was rightfully mine than $2 million built on fraud and guilt. Sloan smiled when I said that and told me most people in my position would fight to keep everything regardless of how they got it. 3 weeks later, the criminal charges came through. The district attorney filed formal charges against Rory and Dennis for mortgage fraud, forgery, and identity theft. Sloan called me that afternoon with the news, and I sat on my hotel bed staring at the wall, trying to process that my uncles were actually facing felony charges. Within 2 days, both of them had hired criminal defense attorneys who started calling the prosecutor's office about plea deals. Sloan heard through her contacts that each lawyer was trying to minimize their client's responsibility by blaming the other uncle. Rory's attorney claimed Dennis masterminded the whole scheme and pressured Rory into participating. Dennis's attorney said Rory did all the forgery work, and Dennis just accepted money he thought was from a legitimate loan. Neither story was completely true, but watching them turn on each other felt grimly satisfying after months of them acting like family loyalty meant covering for crimes. Derek's cooperation paid off exactly like his attorney promised. The prosecutor granted him full immunity from charges related to the Airbnb operation in exchange for his testimony about the mortgage fraud timeline and family dynamics. He had to give a detailed deposition about when Rory and Dennis started acting secretive, when the bank statements stopped coming to the house, and how the family functioned over the past 18 months. Derek called me after the deposition and said it took 4 hours, and he felt like he'd betrayed everyone, but he knew it was the right choice. I told him he made the only choice that didn't involve criminal charges, and sometimes doing the right thing means other people get angry. Deborah stopped speaking to him completely after she found out about the immunity deal. She left him a voicemail calling him a traitor and a snitch who destroyed the family to save himself. Kyle sent him threatening texts until Derek blocked his number. Even Sienna was cold to him for a few weeks, though she eventually came around when she realized Derek's testimony was helping my case against the people who'd actually committed serious crimes. Deborah's daycare operation ended with a cease and desist order delivered by a city inspector. The order came with substantial fines for operating without proper permits, insurance, or licensing. The inspector's report detailed 8 children under age 5 being supervised in a backyard with no safety equipment, no certified caregivers, and no emergency procedures. Deborah had to shut down immediately and refund parents for prepaid care, which wiped out most of the cash she'd been collecting under the table. She was furious at everyone, convinced we'd all conspired to destroy her livelihood. She called Sloane's office 6 times in one day demanding to know who reported her, but Sloane's assistant just told her to direct all communication through her attorney. Deborah didn't have an attorney yet because she couldn't afford one after the refunds and fines. She ended up staying with her church friends and posting long rants on social media about family betrayal and persecution, tagging me and Derek in posts that made us both look like villains. I blocked her after the 3rd post and tried not to think about how she genuinely believed she was the victim in all this. Kyle disappeared on a Tuesday morning and didn't tell anyone where he went. Sienna texted me 2 weeks later saying he'd gone to stay with friends in New Jersey to avoid potential drug charges. She said he was paranoid that the police would search the house and find evidence in the attic, even though he'd supposedly cleaned everything out. His absence made the house situation slightly less volatile since he'd been the most aggressive about defending the family's right to live there rent-free. But his dealing had already created legal exposure for the property that wouldn't go away just because he ran. Houston's surveillance footage showed multiple suspicious visitors to the attic at night, and the prosecutor said they could potentially charge the property itself with facilitating drug transactions even if Kyle was gone. Sloane was working on an argument that I had no knowledge of the dealing and shouldn't be held responsible for illegal activity I didn't authorize or benefit from, but it added another layer of legal complexity to an already complicated situation. The bank's fraud investigation concluded with a formal determination that the mortgage was fraudulent. Sapphira called me personally to explain that they were voiding the entire loan and removing it from my credit report, acknowledging I was a victim of identity theft. She said this was actually unusual because banks often tried to hold property owners partially responsible, but the evidence was so clear that I had no involvement that they couldn't justify it. The bank would pursue civil action against Rory and Dennis to recover the $400,000 they'd stolen, which meant my uncles faced criminal charges and a massive civil lawsuit. Sapphira said cases like this usually ended with the defendants declaring bankruptcy and the bank recovering almost nothing, but they had to try. She sounded genuinely sympathetic when she told me she was sorry my family had put me through this, and I appreciated that she treated me like a victim instead of a suspect. Getting the fraudulent mortgage off my credit report felt like a huge victory, the first time in months that something had actually gone in my favor without strings attached. Sloane started negotiating with the remaining family members about voluntarily vacating the property. Most of them had attorneys by now, either court-appointed or scraped together from savings, and the attorneys understood that eviction proceedings would look bad for their clients given the criminal cases. Dennis's wife moved out first, taking their belongings and leaving without saying goodbye to anyone. Deborah moved to her church friend's house permanently after the daycare shut down. Derek had already found an apartment in Queens and was packing his basement space. Sienna wanted to leave but had nowhere to go and no money, so Sloane helped her apply for emergency housing assistance for young adults. Rory stayed in the guest room acting like nothing had changed, showing up for meals and watching TV like he wasn't facing felony charges. My mother remained in the master bedroom and refused to discuss moving, telling anyone who asked that this was her mother's house, and she had every right to be here. The house felt like a pressure cooker with half the occupants gone, and the remaining ones pretending everything was normal while lawyers negotiated their exits. Houston's continued investigation uncovered something that made everything worse. He found credit card statements in my name sent to a P.O. box I'd never opened, showing cards I'd never applied for with balances totaling $35,000. The cards had been opened over the past year, one every few months and used for cash advances and everyday purchases. Houston traced the P.O. box to an address 2 blocks from the brownstone, rented under my mother's name. She'd been committing identity theft against me for a full year while living in my grandmother's bedroom and pretending to be the martyred daughter protecting family. The credit card fraud made it impossible to maintain any relationship with her going forward. I'd been trying to hold on to some hope that maybe we could eventually reconcile, that maybe her will alteration had been misguided protection rather than calculated manipulation. But stealing my identity to run up debt showed a level of deliberate harm I couldn't forgive or forget. I filed a police report the same day Houston showed me the evidence. The detective handling the mortgage case added the credit card fraud to his investigation, and my mother was brought in for questioning 3 days later. She showed up with an attorney who immediately started talking about plea deals and minimizing charges. The detective told me later that she'd admitted to opening the cards but claimed she intended to pay them back before I noticed, the same excuse Rory and Dennis had used about the mortgage. She was formally charged with identity theft and fraud, facing potential jail time on top of probation and restitution. Her attorney pushed hard for a plea deal that would keep her out of prison, arguing she had no criminal history and was a caretaker for elderly family before this. The prosecutor wasn't sympathetic given the pattern of fraud she'd established with the will alteration and ongoing identity theft. Watching my own mother get charged with crimes against me felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else's family instead of mine. The emotional weight of everything hit me hard over the next several days. I barely left my hotel room, ordering food delivery and ignoring calls from everyone except Sloan. I couldn't stop thinking about how my mother had looked at me across that diner table and lied about protecting me while she was actively stealing my identity. How she'd altered grandmother's will and then acted wounded when I found out. How she'd built this entire trap to control me through shared guilt and family obligation. I felt like I'd lost my mother and my grandmother at the same time, mourning both the woman who died and the woman who'd betrayed me so thoroughly. Sloan called on the fourth day and said she was recommending a therapist who specialized in family trauma, someone who'd helped other clients navigate similar situations. I made an appointment for the following week and started going every Tuesday, talking through the betrayal and grief with someone who understood that family abuse was still abuse, even when it came from people who claimed to love you. The probate hearing took place 6 weeks after we filed the challenge. I sat in the courtroom with Sloan while the judge reviewed the evidence William Park provided about grandmother's original will. The judge examined the documents for what felt like hours, comparing the signatures, reading through grandmother's intentions as documented by her attorney. My mother sat on the opposite side of the room with her lawyer, refusing to look at me. Deborah was there too, arms crossed, glaring at everyone. The judge finally looked up and stated that the evidence clearly showed grandmother intended to split the property 7 ways among family members. The altered will my mother submitted was invalid. I would own 1/7 of the brownstone, not the entire property. My hands shook as I processed what this meant. I'd lost most of my inheritance, but at least the outcome was based on what grandmother actually wanted, not my mother's manipulation. Sloan leaned over and whispered that this was actually good for my case. We left the courthouse and drove back to her office where she explained the next steps. Since the property now had 7 co-owners who couldn't agree on anything and several faced criminal charges, we could force a sale through partition action. The proceeds would get split according to the valid will. After legal fees and costs of resolving the fraud cases, I'd receive approximately $285,000. It was far less than the $2 million inheritance I thought I had, but Sloan reminded me it was clean money based on legitimate legal processes, not fraud. 3 weeks later, Rory's attorney contacted the prosecutor about a plea deal. Rory agreed to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for probation, restitution, and community service. He'd avoid prison time if he paid back his portion of the mortgage fraud money and completed 200 hours of community service. Dennis refused to take a deal. His attorney convinced him he could win at trial by blaming everything on Rory, claiming he was manipulated into participating. I sat through 4 days of Dennis's trial, watching him try to present himself as a victim of Rory's schemes. The prosecutor showed the jury bank records proving Dennis actively participated in redirecting my mail and accessing the fraudulent mortgage money. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Dennis to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. During sentencing, the judge stated that Dennis's attempts to shift blame and complete lack of remorse warranted a harsher sentence than Rory's plea agreement. Dennis stared straight ahead as the bailiffs led him away, still refusing to accept responsibility for what he'd done. My mother's case moved faster because her attorney pushed hard for a plea deal. She agreed to plead guilty to identity theft charges in exchange for 5 years probation, full restitution of the $35,000 in credit card debt, and mandatory counseling sessions twice a month. The plea agreement included a no-contact order prohibiting her from contacting me for the entire duration of her probation. I watched her sign the paperwork in the prosecutor's office, her hand trembling slightly. She glanced at me once before leaving with her attorney, her face showing no emotion. That was the last time I saw her in person. Deborah moved out of the brownstone 2 days after the probate ruling. She went to stay with friends from her church, immediately telling them her version of events where I destroyed the family over money and greed. I heard through mutual connections that she was painting herself as the victim, conveniently leaving out her unlicensed daycare operation and her role in the family dysfunction. She called me once, screaming about how I'd ruined everything, before Sloan sent her attorney a cease and desist letter. After that, Deborah communicated only through her lawyer about the property sale. Derek surprised me by actually following through on his promises to change. He found a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens and got a legitimate job doing building maintenance for a property management company. He started texting me every few weeks with updates about his life and apologies for his actions. The messages were brief and respectful, never asking for anything or making excuses. I appreciated that he was taking real responsibility instead of trying to justify what he'd done. Our relationship stayed distant, but not completely broken. I could see him genuinely trying to be better, which was more than most of my family managed. Sienna's testimony about Kyle's manipulation became crucial when he finally returned from New Jersey after 2 months of hiding. The prosecutor charged him with drug distribution and using my property for illegal activities. Kyle's attorney negotiated a plea deal that sent him to drug court instead of prison. He'd have to complete an 18-month treatment program, maintain steady employment, and submit to random drug testing. If he violated any terms of his probation, he'd serve 3 years in prison. Kyle accepted the deal and enrolled in the program, though I had no contact with him throughout the process. Sienna told me he was doing okay, attending his sessions and working at a warehouse, but we both knew our relationship with Kyle was permanently damaged. The brownstone went on the market in early spring. The real estate agent warned us that the property's legal history and needed repairs would affect the sale price. She listed it for $2.1 million, hoping to get close to $2 million. Within 3 weeks, we had an offer for $1.95 million from a developer who planned to renovate and flip it. All 7 co-owners had to agree to accept the offer, which took another week of negotiations through various attorneys. Deborah tried to hold out for more money, but her lawyer convinced her this was the best offer we'd get. The closing process dragged on for 6 weeks while the title company worked through various liens and legal issues related to the fraud cases. Every few days brought a new complication that required additional paperwork or legal filings. I finally received the wire transfer for my portion of the sale proceeds on a Tuesday afternoon in June. After all legal fees, repairs, outstanding property taxes, and costs related to resolving the fraud cases, my share came to $278,000. I sat in my hotel room staring at my bank account balance, trying to process that this was all that remained of grandmother's $2 million inheritance. It was roughly 1/7 of the original value, minus the massive costs of legal battles and family destruction. But Sloan was right when she'd told me months earlier that this money was clean. It came from legitimate legal processes, not fraud or manipulation. Nobody could claim I'd stolen it or schemed to get it. I'd simply insisted on honesty and accepted the consequences, even when those consequences meant losing most of what I thought was mine. Within 3 days of receiving my share of the sale proceeds, Deborah's attorney sent a formal letter demanding a larger portion of the money. She claimed that because she'd been living in the house and maintaining the property for 18 months, she deserved compensation beyond her 1/7 share. Her lawyer argued that her presence had prevented vandalism and kept the utilities running, which somehow entitled her to an additional $50,000. Sloan forwarded me the letter with a single-line response asking if I wanted her to handle it. I told her to respond with whatever legal language meant absolutely not. Deborah's attorney withdrew the claim 2 weeks later after Sloan pointed out that Deborah had been living rent-free, running an illegal daycare that actually damaged the property, and had no legal grounds whatsoever for additional compensation. Deborah accepted her share of roughly $280,000, while calling everyone she knew to complain about how I'd stolen her rightful inheritance. I heard through Derek that she was telling her church group I'd manipulated the legal system and cheated the family out of what grandmother really wanted. I transferred $15,000 to pay off the credit card debt my mother had accumulated in my name, watching the balances drop to zero for the first time in over a year. The credit monitoring service cost $12 a month, but seeing the alerts come through showing no new accounts or inquiries made it worth every penny. I set up fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus and changed every password on every account I owned. The financial advisor Sloan recommended helped me create a budget that would stretch my remaining $263,000 while I rebuilt my credit score and figured out what came next. She told me that with careful management and steady income, I could recover financially within 3 to 5 years. It felt like forever, but at least the foundation was solid instead of built on lies. Shelby invited me over for tea on a Saturday afternoon about a week after the closing finished. Her house still smelled like lemon polish and old books, exactly the way grandmother's house used to smell before my family moved in and destroyed it. We sat in her kitchen with the good china she only used for special occasions, and she poured Earl Grey into cups that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She told me that my grandmother had talked about her biggest fear during those final months, which was that her children would fight over money and forget what actually mattered. Shelby said grandmother wanted the family to take care of each other, but not at the expense of honesty and self-respect. She told me that insisting on truth even when it hurt was exactly what grandmother would have wanted, that preserving her legacy meant preserving her values of integrity and honesty. Shelby squeezed my hand across the table and said, grandmother would be proud I'd refused to be complicit in fraud just to keep false peace. The conversation didn't fix the guilt I felt about the family falling apart, but it helped me understand that protecting the legacy sometimes meant letting the people go. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in Sunset Park, far enough from the old brownstone in the park slope that I wouldn't accidentally run into family members at the grocery store. The apartment was small, maybe 600 square feet total, with a kitchen barely big enough for one person and a bathroom that needed updating. But the lease was in my name only, with no co-signers or family members who could claim they had rights to the space. I signed the lease and paid first month, last month, and security deposit from my proceeds, watching my bank account drop but feeling lighter than I had in 2 years. Moving day was just me and the few belongings I'd managed to salvage from the brownstone before everything got divided up in the sale. I unpacked boxes in complete silence, hanging my own pictures on walls that belonged to me, arranging furniture in a space where nobody could demand access or claim they deserved to stay. The apartment was mine, completely and totally mine, with no hidden mortgages or family members running illegal businesses in the basement. 6 months after the closing, Derek sent me a text message asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. The message was straightforward and honest, saying he'd been working steadily as a building supervisor and going to therapy twice a month to understand why he'd made the choices he did. He said he wanted to apologize properly, in person, without expecting me to forgive him, or pretend everything was fine. I stared at the message for 3 days before responding, weighing whether I wanted any contact with family members who'd been part of the disaster. Finally, I agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Brooklyn Heights, neutral territory where neither of us had history. Derek showed up 10 minutes early, looking more put together than I'd seen him in years, wearing clean clothes that actually fit, and carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. He bought my coffee without making a big deal about it, and we sat at a table by the window where the afternoon light made everything feel less heavy. Derek apologized for the Airbnb scheme, for lying about the income, for being part of the system that nearly destroyed my financial future. He didn't make excuses or try to justify what he'd done, just acknowledged that he'd been selfish and short-sighted and willing to exploit family connection for personal gain. He told me his therapist had helped him understand that grandmother's death created a vacuum in the family structure, and everyone's worst impulses rushed in to fill that space. He said he'd been so focused on making money that he never stopped to consider he was stealing from family, that the "it's not really stealing if it's from family" mentality had poisoned all of us. We talked for 2 hours about how dysfunction becomes normal when everyone's participating, how easy it is to justify terrible behavior when everyone around you is doing the same thing. We agreed that we'd probably never be close again, that too much damage had been done for us to go back to how things were before. But we also agreed that we didn't have to be enemies, that we could exist in the same family orbit without pretending the past didn't happen. Sienna graduated high school in June and posted about it on Instagram, where I still followed her from a distance. Her girlfriend was in half the photos, and Sienna looked genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen when she was living in the attic and stealing my belongings. She'd come out to the family about her relationship after Kyle got sent to drug court, no longer afraid of his threats to expose her if she didn't help with his schemes. She started community college in the fall and got a part-time job at a bookstore in her neighborhood, building a life that had nothing to do with the family chaos that had consumed her teenage years. She texted me occasionally with updates about her classes or funny things that happened at work, and I responded with encouragement and questions that showed I cared about her progress. Our relationship stayed distant but genuine, built on the understanding that we'd both been trapped in a system that brought out our worst selves. I learned through a mutual friend that my mother had completed her probation requirements and moved to Florida to live near her sister. The friend mentioned it casually, like it was normal family news, not understanding that my mother and I hadn't spoken since the plea deal went through. I felt nothing when I heard the news, just a distant acknowledgement that she'd finished her legal obligations and left the state. We hadn't spoken in over a year, and I'd accepted that our relationship might never recover from her betrayals. She'd forged a will, stolen my identity for credit cards, and orchestrated a trap that nearly destroyed my financial future. Some damage was too deep to repair, and some relationships were too poisoned to save. My therapist helped me work through the complicated grief of losing both my grandmother and the family I thought I had within the same 2-year period. We spent sessions talking about how I could love the people my family used to be while accepting that those people either never existed or had been consumed by their worst impulses. She taught me to separate the people from their actions, to understand that loving someone didn't mean tolerating their abuse or manipulation. The grief came in waves, hitting me at random moments when I'd remember grandmother's laugh or the way the family used to gather for holidays before everything fell apart. But slowly, over months of weekly sessions, I learned to hold both truths at once, that I could mourn what I'd lost while accepting that staying would have destroyed me. The letter from Rory arrived on a Tuesday in October, forwarded from my old address to my new apartment. His handwriting on the envelope looked shaky, less confident than I remembered. Inside was 3 pages of careful writing, apologizing for the mortgage fraud and acknowledging that he'd destroyed any trust we might have had. He wrote that completing his community service had given him time to think about what he'd done, how he'd justified forgery and fraud by telling himself he'd pay the money back before I noticed. He said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again, that he wasn't writing to ask for forgiveness, but to take full responsibility for his choices. The letter felt genuine in a way that surprised me, without the defensive justifications or blame shifting that had poisoned so many family interactions. I read it twice, then filed it away in a folder with other legal documents from that period. I didn't respond because there was nothing to say that would change what happened, and I'd decided to let that chapter of my life stay closed. I registered for Introduction to Social Work at the community college 3 months after the Brownstone sold. The course met Tuesday and Thursday evenings in a basement classroom that smelled like old coffee and marker ink. 23 students sat in plastic chairs, most of them working full-time jobs during the day, trying to build something better for themselves. The professor asked us to write about what brought us to social work, and I stared at the blank page for 10 minutes. I didn't mention the brownstone or the fraud or my mother's crimes. I just said I'd witnessed how families could destroy each other over money and property, and I wanted to help people recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Maya Lambert's email arrived 2 weeks into the semester, forwarded through Sloan, who'd mentioned I was taking classes. Maya wrote that she'd love to meet for coffee and talk about social work as a career path, that she remembered our first consultation, and thought I had good instincts for recognizing exploitation patterns. We met at a cafe near her office, and she spent an hour asking about my classes and my goals, offering to connect me with professionals in the field and review my assignments if I wanted feedback. She said the best social workers were people who'd survived their own family dysfunction and learned to transform their pain into purpose, but only if they'd done enough healing work to maintain boundaries. I told her about my weekly therapy sessions, and she nodded with approval, saying self-awareness was the foundation of ethical practice. The credit monitoring app sent me a notification 13 months after the sale closed, showing my score had climbed back above 700. I sat on my apartment floor staring at the number, remembering when it had dropped to 512 after the mortgage fraud was discovered. I'd spent the year paying every bill exactly on time, keeping my credit card balance below 30%, disputing the last fraudulent charges my mother had made in my name. The money from the Brownstone sale sat mostly untouched in a high-yield savings account, earning modest interest while I figured out what to do with it. I'd used some to pay off the credit card debt and cover my legal fees, set aside money for tuition and living expenses, but the bulk of it remained saved. It wasn't the $2 million inheritance I'd expected, but it was clean money earned through legitimate legal processes, and I'd learned to budget carefully and plan for the future, instead of letting family drain everything I had. I'd started tracking my expenses in a spreadsheet, setting aside money for retirement even though I was only 28, building the kind of financial stability my grandmother had wanted for me even if she'd gone about it all wrong. The message came through a cousin I barely knew, someone on my father's side who'd never been involved in the Brownstone situation. She said Deborah had asked her to reach out because Deborah wanted to reconcile and rebuild our relationship after everything that had happened. I read the forwarded message 3 times, noting how Deborah focused entirely on how difficult the past 2 years had been for her, how she'd lost her home and her income and her standing in her church community. She wrote that families should forgive each other and move forward, that holding grudges only hurt everyone involved, that she hoped I could find it in my heart to let go of the past. There was no acknowledgement of the illegal daycare or the lies or the role she'd played in the family's destruction of my inheritance. No apology for telling me I was tearing the family apart when I'd simply refused to keep covering up everyone's crimes. I wrote back to my cousin thanking her for passing along the message, but explaining that I wasn't interested in reconciliation with Deborah at this time. I said reconciliation required both people to acknowledge what happened and take responsibility for their actions, and Deborah's message showed she wasn't ready to do that work. My cousin responded with understanding, saying she'd suspected Deborah wasn't being fully honest about the situation, but had agreed to pass along the message anyway. Sienna texted me 4 months later with an update about Kyle that I hadn't asked for but appreciated anyway. She said he'd completed drug court successfully and gotten his record sealed, that he'd moved to Philadelphia for a job at a warehouse and seemed to be staying clean based on their occasional phone calls. She wrote that they weren't close anymore, and probably never would be after everything he'd put her through, but she was glad he was making positive changes, even if it was too late to repair their relationship. I responded saying I was glad to hear he was doing better, and thanked her for letting me know. I meant it genuinely, even though I had no intention of reaching out to Kyle or reconnecting with him in any way. Some family relationships were too damaged to salvage, and that was okay, but I could still hope he built a decent life for himself somewhere far away from Brooklyn. Sienna and I had settled into an occasional texting relationship, where we updated each other on major life events, but didn't pretend we were close. She was doing well at community college and working part-time at a bookstore, living with her girlfriend in a small apartment in Queens. We'd probably never be family in any meaningful sense, but we weren't enemies either, which felt like the best possible outcome given everything that had happened. The volunteer coordinator at the food bank introduced us during my third shift sorting donations in the warehouse. He was new too, struggling to figure out the organization system for canned goods, and we ended up working the same station for 2 hours, making awkward small talk about nothing important. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee after the shift ended, and I almost said no, my default response to anyone showing romantic interest, but something made me agree. We sat at a diner booth, and I told him the basic outline of my family history within the first 30 minutes, explaining that I had complicated relationships with most of my relatives and wasn't in contact with several of them. He listened without judgment, and then shared that his parents had divorced messily when he was 12, and he hadn't spoken to his father in 8 years. That family dysfunction wasn't a deal-breaker for him. We started dating slowly after that, meeting for coffee between his shifts at the hospital where he worked as a nurse and my evening classes. He was patient when I needed space and respected my boundaries when I said I wasn't ready for certain things, never pushing or demanding more than I could give. 3 months in, I realized I was learning what healthy relationships looked like, how two people could care about each other without manipulation or guilt or keeping score. Derek's wedding invitation arrived in a cream envelope with elegant script, my name written carefully on the front. The card inside was simple and tasteful, inviting me to a small ceremony at a restaurant in Queens, followed by dinner with 20 guests. He'd included a handwritten note on the back acknowledging that he would understand completely if I wasn't comfortable attending, that he wanted me there, but respected whatever decision I made. I texted him 2 days later saying I'd come, that I was happy he'd rebuilt his life and found someone who made him happy. The wedding was on a Saturday afternoon in October, and I wore a blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, arriving 15 minutes early and sitting in the back row of chairs. Derek looked genuinely happy standing at the front waiting for his fiancée to walk down the makeshift aisle, and his smile when he saw me was warm but not presumptuous. None of our other relatives were present, just Derek's friends from work and his fiancée's family, and the ceremony was short and sweet with no drama or tension. I stayed for dinner and made polite conversation with strangers, leaving after the cake cutting with a genuine sense that Derek had actually changed and built something good for himself. Sloane's referral came through an email introduction 6 months into my social work program, connecting me with a woman whose brother had forged her signature on a home equity loan. The woman's situation was eerily similar to mine, and I spent 2 hours on the phone walking her through the steps I'd taken, the attorneys I'd worked with, the documentation she needed to gather. Sloane started sending me similar referrals regularly after that, clients dealing with family financial abuse who needed someone who understood the emotional complexity of reporting relatives to authorities. I began building an informal practice helping people navigate these situations, offering free consultations and referrals to legal resources while I finished my degree. The work gave purpose to everything I'd gone through with my family, transforming my experience into something useful that could help others avoid the same traps. Sloane and I met for lunch quarterly to discuss cases, and she offered guidance on maintaining professional boundaries while using my personal experience to connect with clients. She reminded me that my story was valuable, but I needed to be careful not to project my specific situation onto every client's unique circumstances. The cemetery was quiet on a Tuesday morning in November, 2 years and 3 months after my grandmother died. I'd avoided visiting her grave since the funeral, unable to face the stone marker while everything with the family was still unresolved and chaotic. But I'd woken up that morning knowing it was time to go, to tell her what had happened and explain the choices I'd made. I brought yellow roses because they'd been her favorite and stood at her grave for 20 minutes before I could speak. I told her about the will alteration and the mortgage fraud and all the illegal activities her children and grandchildren had conducted in her house. I explained that I'd tried to honor her memory by insisting on truth even when it meant the family fell apart, that I'd chosen honesty over keeping everyone comfortable in their dysfunction. I said I hoped she would understand why I'd called the police and pressed charges, why I'd let the house be sold instead of continuing to enable people who refused to take responsibility for their actions. I told her I missed her and wished she'd been clearer about her actual wishes instead of leaving me with vague instructions to take care of family, that her attempt to protect everyone had actually created the conditions for them to destroy each other. I stood there crying for a while after I finished talking, then placed the roses on her grave and walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had in months. Shelby invited me to her house for tea the following week, the first of what became regular visits every few weeks. She served Earl Grey in delicate china cups and told me stories about my grandmother's actual character and values, the things she believed in before family guilt and obligation complicated everything. Shelby said my grandmother had been fiercely independent and practical, someone who valued honesty and hard work above family loyalty for its own sake. She said my grandmother would have been proud that I stood up for myself and insisted on truth even when it cost me relationships, that protecting her legacy meant preserving her values of integrity, rather than enabling her children's worst impulses. We spent 2 hours talking about my grandmother's life before she got sick, the woman she'd been when she was healthy and strong and clear-minded. These visits helped me remember the good parts of my family history, without romanticizing the dysfunction or pretending things had been better than they were. Shelby became a surrogate grandmother figure, someone who shared my grandmother's generation and values without the complicated family baggage that had poisoned so many relationships. The acceptance letter from the graduate program arrived in March, offering me a spot in their clinical social work program with a focus on family systems and financial abuse. I'd applied 6 months earlier with an essay about my experience with family exploitation, explaining how surviving my own situation had given me insight and empathy for clients dealing with similar dynamics. The program director called me personally to discuss my application and emphasized the importance of maintaining boundaries and not projecting my story onto clients, making sure I understood the ethical considerations of using personal experience in professional practice. I assured her I'd been working with a therapist specifically on these issues and understood the difference between drawing on my experience for empathy and making assumptions about other people's situations. The program started in September, and I spent the summer preparing, reading textbooks, and taking extra volunteer shifts at the food bank to build my practical experience. I felt ready to turn everything I'd survived into something meaningful, to help other people recognize and escape the kind of family traps that had almost destroyed me. I started my second year of graduate school that September, taking advanced courses in family systems therapy and financial exploitation patterns. The coursework challenged me in ways I hadn't expected, forcing me to examine my own experiences through clinical frameworks while maintaining professional distance. My thesis project focused on intergenerational financial abuse in families where property inheritance becomes a weapon, and my advisor praised my ability to balance personal insight with academic rigor. I'd built a small private practice on the side, seeing clients 2 evenings a week in a shared office space in Sunset Park. Most of my clients dealt with family boundary issues or financial manipulation, and I found deep satisfaction in helping them recognize patterns I'd lived through myself. The work felt meaningful in ways my previous corporate job never had, like I'd finally found a way to transform pain into purpose without letting it consume me. My relationship with the person I'd met through volunteering had grown into something stable and healthy, built on honesty about my complicated past and respect for the boundaries I needed to maintain. We moved in together that spring, splitting rent on a small apartment in Brooklyn Heights with big windows and no family history attached to the walls. For the first time in years, I came home to a space that felt genuinely mine, where nobody was hiding secrets or running schemes behind my back. My chosen family had expanded to include Maya, Sloan, a few close friends from graduate school, and Shelby, who still invited me for tea every few weeks. These relationships felt different from blood family, lighter somehow, built on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. I celebrated my 30th birthday surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being, and I realized I hadn't thought about the brownstone or the eviction notice in weeks. The therapy sessions I'd started 3 years ago had taught me that losing most of my family wasn't a failure on my part, but a necessary boundary against people who refused to stop hurting me. I'd learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish, that sometimes love means letting go of relationships that poison everything they touch. My mother still lived in Florida, and we hadn't spoken since her probation ended. Deborah occasionally sent messages through distant cousins, always focused on her own hardships, rather than acknowledging the damage she'd caused. Derek and Sienna remained the only family members I stayed in contact with, both of them building better lives after facing real consequences for their actions. The permanent damage to most family relationships used to keep me awake at night, but now I understood that some fractures can't and shouldn't be repaired. I'd built something genuine from the ruins of my inheritance, a life based on honesty rather than manipulation, and I was genuinely happy with what I'd created. The brownstone was gone, most of my family was gone, but I'd gained something more valuable than property or blood ties. I'd gained myself back. So yeah, that's the whole thing. Nothing too deep, just another random story I somehow turned into a whole video. Thanks for hanging out, it's always chill talking here.